Welcome back to Too Light, Too Dark, the podcast where we explore the spaces between authenticity, human experience, and the capturing of light and shade in everyday life. As the show develops and evolves, I'm starting to see that the world isn't just light or dark, most of it lives somewhere in the middle. This is episode 27, and today's guest is a UK based harm reduction advocate who's been working to shift the conversation around drugs. So today we're digging into what it really means, why it matters, and how it impacts real lives from our guest specialized experience. But this isn't just about policy or theory, it's about people, stories, and perspectives. So, with these words as flowers of introduction, I'd like to welcome today Mark Gilman.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
So, to start off, to get a little bit on origin, how did you first get involved in harm reduction work?
Right. Well, I first started to self-medicate myself at the tender age of 12, following my father's untimely early demise, and my mum basically dealt with her grief through alcohol and prescribed medication. So I availed myself of what I realise now would probably benzodiazepine, and that introduced me to the world of drugs and everything, and I was kind of schooled by children, really 13, 14-year-old boys who were burgling pharmacies, chemists for amphetamines for the northern soul scene, and they used to give each other advice on what we would now call harm reduction.
And first thing that jumps out at me, Mark, is I've had a couple of people on here who have that early life trauma. And I'll speak personally. Again, I've lost my dad not really knowing kind of who he was and how he functioned, and everything that I heard about him was almost kind of mythical, almost like an enigma. How much effect do you think that had on you growing up and the choices that you made, Mark?
I was self-medicating from from 12 with what I realise now would have been benzodiazepines, but that soon ended. But I entered the world of petty crime, really, and started going into pubs at a very early age. School, I was actually at a grammar school called a technical grammar school back in those days in Bury, in North Manchester, the Derby School, if anybody remembers it. It was, yeah, in those days, you had to pass your 11 plus to go to grammar school. So I passed the 11 plus, but I didn't get accepted to the fee-paying grammar school, Bury Grammar School. So they had another, what they called a technical grammar school. So, and I was, as I said before, I was doing okay first year. Then as soon as my dad died, that's it. All bets off, you know, drugs, crime, petty crime, and then alcohol. Not as a problem initially, but it did the same thing that benzodiazepines did. You know, it gave me the same relief from myself, from that what I now understand to have been that trauma, you know, of my dad dropping dead and my mum, God bless her, not surviving very well. And then I went through school. I was constantly being arrested in the police station. It got to that point where my mum, I mean, God bless her, she just couldn't. She had a shop to run 7 days a week. So I had, for a lot of the times when I were arrested, I had no responsible adult, which you needed to have to be charged. And so I got very friendly with the police. With the one guy, God bless him, the juvenile liaison officer, became like a bit of a father figure, really. Anyway, and I got to 15 and I was facing another offence which would have seen me go to Borstal, young offenders. And a man, a teacher, Jack Sandham, he was called, he said to me, "This is a crying shame, Mark." He said, "You're a bright lad, blah, blah, blah. You know, to see you go to Borstal, young offenders, would break my heart. So it's not too late to get 4 O-levels." And I'm like, "I've not been to school for months." And he said, "Well, I always turned up for football practice. I'm always obsessed with football." So he said, "I'll do a deal with you. If you'll come, you know, when you come to football practice, let's see if we can get English and maths. And then we can get, he were a funny guy. He said, you can get woodwork and metalwork standing on your head." You know, and I did. So long story short, I managed to scramble together 4 O-levels, and that got me a place in Bircham Newton in Norfolk, which for me was acting as an alternative to custody, but for most other boys there, it was just a legitimate further education college run by the Construction Industry Training Board. So a lot of my lifelong friends that I made then were like sons. A lot of them were sons of Irish immigrants, London Irish type guys working for Bovis and Wimpy, McAlpine's Fusiliers, as we regularly sang, so I stuck that out for a year, more or less, and then I've always been a lifelong Manchester United fan, and I went watching United, I think at Southampton, towards the end of that year, and I got involved in nefarious activity and never went back. And then I was 16, going on 17, and then from 16, 17 until 25, nearly 10 years, I was basically ducking and diving, on that, in that world between licit and illicit, nothing majorly criminal, and because I always had access to cash because of my mum's shop. And so I learned a lesson very early that money makes money, and me and manual labour became strangers, shall we say? I remember getting sacked once from a job as a plasterer's labourer, and I'd been drunk the night before on a Thursday when we got paid on a Thursday, and I'd fallen asleep in the sandpit on a Friday, and the guy came, and the boss, and he said, "Mark, your heart's not in this." And in those days, I said, "Oh, what's going on, Wolf?" He said, "You can lick 'em and stick 'em," which were your cards, So that were me. That were my brief flirtation with manual labour gone. And then I became a hippie, man. And I ended up I went to Ibiza in early doors, mid-70s. And then I were in Morocco in 78, California, 79. And then I were in India in 1980. And in India, whilst I was in India, I got a double dilemma. I'd developed a fondness for smoking opium, but I also got amoebic dysentery. I'm back from India in 1981, and one of Manchester's cannabis dealers said to me, "What are you going to do next?" And I said, "I'm not so sure, but I'm certainly not going anywhere where I can get dysentery again." And he said, "Why don't you go to university?" And I said, "Dave," he's dead now, people like me, people like us don't go to university. The only institutions we go to are mental hospitals and prisons. What on earth are you talking about?" And he said, "No," he said, "you're 25 now. You can apply as a mature student and I can get you an interview. You just have to write an essay and have an interview." So I did, and I got accepted. So I went to Bradford and Ilkley Community College, initially with a full grant back in those days, to be a teacher in primary education, because there was then, and I suspect there still is now, a lack of men in primary schools. So I started that. I did that for 2 years. I really enjoyed the teaching with the kids, but I couldn't stand the classroom. Again, I came up against my nemesis, middle class people, and just couldn't get on in the classroom. So I changed in the final year and finished the first degree in organisation studies. And then by that time, brown powder heroin had arrived in the Northwest and changed everything. 5-pound bags of this brown powder that you didn't need to inject, that you could smoke. It was widely available, through criminal networks. And it changed everything. I remember the first time I ever saw it was at a Free Festival in 1981, the Deeply Vale Free Festival. And Malcolm Owen and the Ruts were playing Babylon's Burning. And somebody brought this bag of brown powder into the crash tent, man. We used to run the crash tent then, which harm reduction, for people having bad trips or people who'd overdosed or whatever. And I'll never forget it. A guy came in and he said, "I've just paid a fiver for this stuff." He said, "I don't know what it is. I thought it were pollen. I've been trying to put it on hot knives and I've tried all sorts." And then somebody said from the bowels of the crash tent, "Oh, you need to throw that on a bit of, anybody got Kit Kat wrapper? You need to throw that on a bit of foil." And thus began, Anyway, so I already knew about that from 81. So 84, I think, when I finished my first degree, I used to drink in a pub in Bradford called the Manville Arms. And I'd been drinking with this guy for 2 years. And I knew he was a teacher at the university. I didn't know he was Professor Jeffrey Pearson, author of Hooligan: A History of Respectable Fears, and all manner of other things. I just knew him as a fellow Manchester United fan who drank in the boozer in Bradford. Anyway, he said, we was one day in the pub and he said, "Oh, what do you think about all this heroin?" I said, "Oh yeah, it's been around for a while." And he said, "Well, I have access to the police national computer and there's been a real spike. There's been several spikes in domestic burglary, but in very particular places on the Wirral in Merseyside and in parts of Manchester, Glasgow. What do you think?" I said, "Well, I don't think I know what it is. It's heroin." you know, and he said, "What, really?" I said, "Yes." Because most, in inverted commas, heroin addicts, in inverted commas, they don't travel very well. They're not master criminals. It's not Raffles planning a heist on some jewellery place in Cheshire. If they live at number 17, once they've used everything in their own house, I'll tell you who's going to get robbed next. Number 19 and number 15. First thing that's going to go is the bikes out of the shed, the lawnmower, and then the telly and everything. He said, "Whoa." Anyway, put a grant in. I said, he put a grant in for the princely sum of £24,000 to investigate young people and heroin in the north of England. And I got the job as research associate together with a woman called Dr. Shirley McIver. And as a result of that, we wrote the first report. I think it was published in 1987. Jeff Pearson then reworked some of the extra qualitative data and produced what I think is a seminal book called The New Heroin Users, which chronicled the rise of this new group of working class heroin users who were initially smoking brown powder heroin. So I then got a job. I taught for Jeff initially, teaching the sociology of social problems at Bradford University. And then I went to work for Lifeline. It's a drug treatment charity in Manchester. Initially as the manager of one of the 19 community drug teams, which was bizarre for me because I actually employed the psychiatrist and the psychologist. I was the manager. And the theory behind the community drug teams were that addiction, in inverted commas, I keep saying that, is a multifaceted thing. So what had happened in 1982 is the Advisory Council on the Misuse of Drugs had produced a report called Treatment and Rehabilitation. And in that report was a definition of a problem drug taker. And the definition of a problem drug taker was anybody who experiences problems related to their drug use in one of four domains: legal, social, psychological, and physical. So because it's a multifaceted problem, the community drug teams need to be multidisciplinary. So we need a psychiatrist, a doctor, a psychologist, a social worker, and we did. Managed that for 2 years, and then I got promoted to be the regional prevention development coordinator for the Northwest region in the northwest of England, which had 19 health districts. And that, in effect, became a harm reduction post on education and training. I mean, it was called, because of the politics at the time, it had to be called the Prevention Development Officer. But what that meant is developing harm reduction initiatives. Yeah, so that was 87. And of course, by that time, we're in Manchester, we start to hear about Liverpool and what we now know as the Mersey model of harm reduction. So despite our intense football rivalries, we went across and, put down metaphorical swords, and we met and we got on. We got on great, So first meetings, myself, Rowdy Yates, who was then the chief exec of Lifeline, Michael Linnell, who did the cartoons, Smack in the Eye, Peanut Pete, and all that stuff, Ian Wardle, and we met Alan Parry, Peter McDermott, Russell Newcomb, Alan Matthews, and John Marks. And the truth of it is, what we all had in common is personal experience of drug use. Now, some of us were less than forthcoming in being public about that because of the politics of the time. On reflection, I never made a big song and dance about it. And I think because I don't know if it's I have an almost pathological distrust of middle class liberals, when they, go public on it, I thought, well, why? We know it works. We know harm reduction works. We know that it can be proven scientifically, and then if you fast forward to the first ever international conference on the reduction of drug-related harm in 1990 in Liverpool, in April of 1990, Professor Sir John Strang did a keynote speech, and I can't quote it verbatim, but he basically said, just be careful now who your fellow travellers are for harm reduction, because you may be seduced to nailing your colours to the legalisation mast. And if you do, obviously that's up to you, but if you do, your access to the corridors of power will be limited. Whereas, you can probably look it up, and we certainly can look it up. He said, whereas if you stick to harm reduction is science, rational, reasonable, yes, you can say things like the famous statement, the laws against drugs are immoral in principle and unworkable in practice, which was the great release statement, I think, originated from when the Rolling Stones, from when Mick Jagger had been arrested in 1968, I think. So by all means, state that as your moral, philosophical standpoint, but quickly move on to the science of harm reduction. Because, of course, by this time, those new heroin users who'd began smoking had pretty much all moved to injecting, because of the finance of it. A £5 bag, once your tolerance builds up, doesn't go very far, whereas the same £5 bag in a needle, goes further. So even people who swore they would never ever inject got over the injection barrier because needs must, So the other thing, of course, that was happening then is this thing called HTLV3, which became HIV and AIDS, which could lead to AIDS, and was a potential death sentence. So we knew that that needn't be the case. And then we made common cause then with comrades and colleagues from San Francisco, from the gay men's scene. I can't remember now. I think a guy called Les Pampas or somebody. Anyway, somebody from the San Francisco Gay Men's Health Collective. So we had a common cause. So we learnt from each other. Yeah, and then I attended the first Liverpool 1990, Barcelona 91, Melbourne 92, Rotterdam 93, and so on and so forth. So yeah, so then by that time we re-rolled my position, and I got the title of Director of Research with the Lifeline project. And Lifeline then, alongside our comrades, friends and colleagues in Merseyside, became staunch harm reductionists.
What a story! If I think about you perusing in Morocco, and then interesting you mentioned Deeply Vale as well, and I suppose coming back to Manchester in that early 80s, and coming back to the Northwest, miners, and then all that kind of socio-political stuff was going on at the same time. That must have been hard for a young person to come into, but somehow you found opportunity within that as well, Mark. Do you think that was like luck or happenstance, or are you that type of person?
Well, I often think about this as I get older. I get towards my 70th birthday, and I still can't. I'm trying to write about it and articulate it. We kind of had, I can't even, like an instrument. We knew that, so for example, Deeply Vale, when the police would come to Deeply Vale began in 1975, just with a few of us going up there at the mushroom season. That's how it began. We're going, because that's where all the mushrooms, really good, place to get psilocybin mushrooms. So a few of us just went up camping there in mushroom season of 75, and we did it again in 76, but then time there were a couple of hundred turned up. And then 77 punk had started. So, and, John Cooper Clarke, who's a good friend of mine, he turned up, the punk poet, the Bard of Salford. He turned up, as did the Drones, Slaughter and the Dogs. Anyway, yeah, lots of the punk celebrities, Buzzcocks turned up. By 79, Steve Hillage played it.
Oh yeah, that's where my mum said that she woke up in a tent. Shouts out to my mum. She
Yeah,
woke up in a tent, and it must have been in that trash area.
yeah.
And she said all she could hear was the last entry was Steve Hillage's bars going out across the field, and then also seen Devo there as well, which is
Evo,
really interesting. But
yeah, yeah.
yeah, she was saying around that 79-80 period mark. That must be right in terms of timeline.
Yeah, yeah. Well, then the last one was 1981, where I mentioned we saw the first brown powder heroin, because by that time we'd had to move from the actual geographical location of Deeply Vale to a place called Pickup Bank near Darwin, because what had happened in 1979 is somebody had stolen the car and dumped it in the stream, and it poisoned
Mm.
some of the cattle. So the farmer, understandably, got really pissed off about it and said, "You're not coming back." So we had to move to, and Pickup Bank was nowhere near. Deeply Vale was like an Arthurian legend, man. It had ley lines. you know. Pickup Bank didn't have that anyway. So it ended in 1981 was the last one when Malcolm, of course, sadly Malcolm Owen died, ironically from a heroin overdose. Not that long after. But yeah, in terms of the politics of the time, you know. The police did try to raid Deeply Vale, but what happened? We put sentries on on the roads, because what had happened then? You remember Punky Reggae Party? So we
Uh-huh.
had, so it were punk, and then there were a big reggae thing going on. So a lot of the Rastas from Moss Side and Cheetham Hill and everywhere had come round, and so we had like I think you put it like a home defense, basically pots and pans to say the Babylon them come no, like banging these pots and pans. But then they were kind of, they were like an instrumentalist attitude of the police, because one of the organisers at Deeply Vale, a guy called Jimmy O'Neill, who's dead now, God bless him, but, Jimmy met with them, with the police, and said, "Look, we're going to do it. You're not going to stop us. We're going to do it anyway. So, what do you think?" And of course, fast forward to, if you just hold on to that idea, then fast forward to 1995, when we had Lifeline hosted the first ever international conference on safer dancing, where we were
Ah,
testing for ecstasy tablets, and it had the full support of Greater Manchester Police.
wow.
you know, um, and I think that's because we got arrested twice for harm reduction activity through a comic that we put out, a very very adult comic called Smack in the Eye. The police, they rang us and said, "This is you're saying here, you're encouraging people to toot, don't shoot, i.e., smoke heroin, don't inject it.
Ah,
And if we can prove that, we believe that the public prosecutions will take you to court for that, because you're contravening the Misuse of Drugs Act, because you're inciting people to use drugs." And of course, we were a lot younger then. We said, "Yeah, let's do it. Oz trial. We'll have our own Oz trial." So anyway, and we met with him in a pub. We met with him in the Church Inn in Prestwich. Me, Rowdy, I think, and Mike Linnell, and a guy called Ron Clark from the police, and another guy called Paul Cook. And he was very, very civilized, and we said, "Yeah, well, let's go to court, let's do it." Anyway, they said, and then they'd taken advice, and we'd taken advice, and then we met him again, and they said, "You know what? No, you'll probably win." So we're not going to do that. And then we got so close to them that when we did put out something on solvents, we actually did a thing about safer solvent use. Saying use Evo stick bags, don't use butane gas. Blah blah blah. That you will definitely get in trouble for that, because of the target population is younger. The
ah.
target population for people in solvent abuse are teenagers, and you will almost certainly be successfully prosecuted under obscenity laws. that you were setting out to deprave and corrupt. So they said, so do not put them out. So we didn't. So we had, yeah, so we had this kind of instrumentalist, I don't even know what you'd call pragmatic response. We're going to do it. Ask for permission. The old thing, never ask for permission, ask for forgiveness. Do it, then ask for forgiveness, And so they kind of, I mean, it sounds like I'm some kind of Che Guevara, but we're going to do it anyway. They knew we were going to do it. We're going to
Yeah.
do it. We're not waiting for your permission. We're going to do it. So how can we reduce the harm for everybody concerned? You know?
And it's interesting. I've had other guests on here as well that have mentioned the pollination between harm reduction coming from that HIV
Mm,
epidemic as well, and how the lessons learned from that were easily applicable in terms of drug usage and the safety developments that come from that. And again, it's kind of key that you mentioned San Francisco and the gay
mm,
scene over there as well. And
mm.
then if you think about how maybe like how the whole acid house generation, how that involved as well,
Yeah,
that's always had like a real kind of harm reduction underpinning, even to this very day, where,
yeah,
now you've got kind of pills being tested. You've got places in Hackney now where you can go and get your drugs tested before you go and know what you're actually putting in your body. And one thing one guy said to me right at the start of this podcast run was safe supplies saves lives as well. What's your takeaway on that as a kind of one-liner? I know it's a lot more complicated on that, but it speaks to what you've seen in your career, Mark.
oh, absolutely. Safe supply saves lives, definitely. I mean, I'm that old that I can remember the tail end of the British system. Where you could be prescribed diamorphine. In fact, the first tragedy, the first death that I experienced amongst a boy that I went to school with as a kid from 5 years old. I mean, I can say he's dead now, Mick Greenacre. I'm absolutely convinced that if he'd been able to secure a diamorphine prescription, I'm not saying he'd still be alive today at 69, nearly 70, but he certainly wouldn't have died in his early 20s, late teens, early 20s, because of the diconol, peach palfium, barbiturates, because all that was on offer by the time then was just methadone on a reducing scale. So why bother? It's just pointless. So I'm absolutely convinced that safe supply absolutely saves lives. Yeah, definitely.
And one thing that I had a guest on, Tony Duffin, who was the ex-CEO of the Anna Liffey project over in Ireland. And one thing that he sort of brought to the table, and something I'd never really thought about, was the sort of definition of harm reduction
Mm,
and how that's never really been, I suppose there's no consistency to that, Mark.
no.
What is your definition of harm reduction and what does it actually mean in practice?
Yeah, well, for me, I take Tony's point, and also he's a friend and a colleague. Yeah, and he's absolutely right. We don't really have a good working definition. It's something that we're trying to address on our International Harm Reduction Roundtable seminars that we hold usually the last Thursday of every month, and certainly one of those will be dedicated to that. For me, it's dead straightforward. There are ways of using drugs that are safer than others.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the starting point is people are going to use drugs. Humans have always used drugs. They always will. Going to time immemorial, whether it's the carvings on the pyramids of poppies, whatever. Humans have always used drugs. They always will. There is an innate desire of the human condition to alter one's consciousness, either for spiritual purposes or to deal with trauma, like myself, or whatever. So people are going to do it. So get used to that idea. Yeah. So prohibition's a complete waste of time. I've only ever witnessed prohibition make things worse. I have
Yeah.
never seen prohibition help anything in any which way anywhere. So people are going to do it, accept that, and then show people how to do it in the safest way, Um, I mean, if you look, but one of the big sales points when we first set up needle and syringe programs way back, we never, in the very early days, we didn't even mention HIV. We just said, look, you've gone to great lengths to buy a £5 bag of heroin. You're injecting it. Why not have a clean pen to do it with? Why risk it getting blocked? In other words, appeal to naked self-interest, really. And then when people then said, "What's all this about, man? Why suddenly we used to have to nick these from vets? You know, we used to have to nick syringes from behind the hospitals. Suddenly you're giving them to us." Then we could say, "Oh, yeah, it's because of this thing called HIV." Well, what's that? Oh, yeah, it's how does that spread? So we weren't lecturing and preaching. We were in the phenomena. So yeah, my definition is there are safer ways, not completely safe, obviously, but there are safer ways of pretty much doing anything, you know, seat belts, you know, uh,
Yeah,
to me, harm reduction is just such common sense, you know.
yeah.
People are going
Traffic
to
lights.
traffic lights, seat belts, traffic lights, zero alcohol beer, low calorie Coke, diet Coke,
Yeah, yeah. It doesn't have to be too complicated. That,
No.
and then the last thing you mentioned there is about the kind of sharing the needles. And when I grew up in Edinburgh, and especially like early '90s to mid '90s, I seen that there was a real kind of concentration of HIV in Edinburgh,
Mm,
and growing up, the my mum's peer group were absolutely decimated, which would the majority of them had sort of end stage AIDS by then,
mm,
as it would be defined, and that was a really difficult thing to see as a youngster. Watch that deterioration, watch the continued using, but that had come of that culture of sharing needles, and as I said, the hotspot was in Edinburgh, Mark, right?
mm. Yeah, it was. Yeah. Yeah, I remember visiting Edinburgh at the time when we brought out the first copy of Smack in the Eye, because we produced it, and what happened, I went up with a guy called Paul Trainer. I don't know if Paul's still around. He was from Wigan, ex-user himself, and we went to Muirhouse in
Mm.
Edinburgh, in a flat. I think it was an organisation called Shadow from memory. Anyway, and we were talking about harm reduction, and I was struck by, well, first of all, the universal nobody smoked anything. You know, in fact, the idea that some of them like, "What you talking about?" No, everything goes in. If it can go in a syringe, it's going in. And that was it. But what were really tragic is, obviously, by then we had vibrant needle and syringe programs in Manchester and Liverpool. Well, the natural comparator has always been for health studies Manchester, Liverpool, Glasgow. So if
Yeah.
you look at the three city study on premature male mortality recently, Manchester, Liverpool, Glasgow. So obviously it's only a few miles to Edinburgh. But yeah, I was really struck by how HIV had gone through that injection drug using community in Edinburgh in a way that it hadn't in Manchester, and certainly not in Liverpool. You know,
No, and I've seen that at the sharp end again. Bringing my mum virtually into the conversation, she had loads of people that she'd grown up with in Leith in Edinburgh, and whole networks, whole groups, sometimes in the same family, all kind of wiped out in that kind of sharing needles at a time that was a offshoot of that sort of,
yeah,
hippie, listen to Dark Side of the Moon, get
yeah,
stoned. It then became sharing needles. It then became Dyke. It then became X and Y and Z, and to the point
yeah,
where, yeah, like a large majority of our peer group are absolutely wiped out. And we done some buddying with somebody that she'd known for a long, long time towards the end of their life, which again was a real difficult watch. But
mm,
it sort of showed me harm reduction right up against my nose
yeah,
and the power of that. And it was just unfortunate in Edinburgh that we had to see the other end of that, where it's not part of
yeah.
policy and it's left to little grassroots organisations to try and drive that home, right?
Oh, it was tragic, mate. Yeah, I remember because, Rowdy in particular, Rowdy Yates, who's died now, God rest him. He was Scottish. He retired into Perth, near Perth in Scotland, and he had a real heart for Scottish drug users. Well, everybody, we all, colleagues, comrades, brothers and sisters. Um, Heartbreaking, because at the same time that was going on in Edinburgh, we had needle and syringe provision in drug dealers' houses. We had we had sharps bins, and people did it because if you come and buy from me, I'll give you a clean works every time. So if you come and get your, by then, probably £10 bag, buy from me. But these were user dealers, don't forget. This was before it got completely commercialised like it is now. 2 brown, 1 white, I'll be there in 5.
Yeah.
Some kid turns up on a scooter or this is when people were still, buying a quarter of an ounce, recouping the money and knocking out the bags to get their own money, and so they were the hippie kind of self-help, mutual aid orientation here, but
Yeah.
not in Edinburgh. It was tragic.
Yeah. Um, and I had a look before we've come on today at your work history over the course, and you've sat in some really interesting positions, whether that be in central government, you've sat within the prison pipelines as well. And
Mm.
speaking of your expertise, like, where do you see the biggest disconnect between policy and what actually works, Mark?
Whew, be careful now. Well, the biggest thing, the one thing that happened on my watch, although that sounds very grandiose, but the thing I'm least proud of is watching the whole successful discharge thing come into the world as a metric. I mean, that was disastrous, really. So we'd done all this stuff on harm reduction. I'd gone from, from being in India and then to being sat in Whitehall, you know, um, only for not that long ago. I think still now. So very quickly, the National Treatment Agency started in 2001. And the idea of the National Treatment Agency is that it would bring together the two organs of state that have never really together. So criminal justice, the Home Office, Ministry of Justice on one hand, and the Department of Health on the other. So drugs and crime, drugs and health. Bring them together. The National Treatment Agency, I was the North East Regional Manager and then North West Regional Manager and then recovery lead, etc. So stage one, get people into treatment. Why? Because it keeps people alive. Get them in, get people in. Get rid of these waiting lists. Get them in immediately. Have same day prescribing. Get them in and get them safe. Right. So great. Massive evidence base. Treatment is protective. Get people in. Tick. Right. They're in. What do we do now? Keep them. Keep them for at least 90 days for this to work. Retention. Great. So get people in, keep them, tick. Evidence based, 100%. Get them in, keep them. Evidence based retention. It works. Keep them in. Methadone maintenance treatment. Not methadone reduction, methadone maintenance treatment, opioid substitution treatments on a maintenance basis for life if needs be, as long as people are alive. There's no recovery in graveyards. So get people in, keep them in, and then through central political change, get them out. This is no good. What do you mean? You call this treatment? Get them out. Then the abstinence agenda came in. And to my, I'll answer for it on Judgment Day. I were instrumental in that. But anyway, what a mess! What a mess! So now providers are financially rewarded for pushing people out. Now they'll deny it, of course, and say that it's people are doing it volitionally, they want to. Maybe they do. But is there not a perverse incentive if you're financially rewarded for how many people you push out? So that's the biggest. I think that's the biggest disconnect. And then if you follow that line through, so that's one successful discharge. And the thing that really bothers me very, very recently is this notion of, people providing needle and syringe program engagement. So Mark and came to pick up so many 1 ml syringes and Leon picks up this about, and then putting it on our clinical records.
Oh,
What's all that about? Why is that necessary? It's meant to be confidential, separate, and yet these same people that are doing it, I'm not going to name any names because the people who are doing it probably do it. I'm not saying they're doing it anyway, why they're doing it, but it baffles me. For me, that's the biggest disconnect. On the one hand, stand up on the platform and say, yeah, you're all about reducing harm and all about, blah, 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 blah. And then, but meanwhile, push him out of treatment. Oh, while you're there, record all the needle and syringe program data on the clinical records. Doesn't make sense to me, mate. That seems like a fundamental disconnect.
Yeah. And I wonder, where does that data go, right? It's like,
Well, I mean, it goes into when they bid for the next contract.
right, and then okay, and gets brought back in
Yeah.
to the sort of bidding environment.
Yeah, yeah,
Ouch.
yeah. So it'll say, look how good we are at getting people out. And let's face it, some of these contracts now, I mean, there's one out now for 10 years. It's a 10-year contract. I mean, you're talking serious chunks of money. I mean, that 10-year contracts, you might be talking 60, 70 million, over the lifetime of the total contract value. So
Yeah,
it's a lot of money, Now, if he who pays the piper calls the tune, if the political masters who award that want you to be able to demonstrate that you can get people out of treatment and into recovery, abstinence-based recovery, then of course you're going to do it and then say that's what people want. And it may well be what people want. But I think it's a fundamental policy disconnect.
yeah, yeah. That's really, yeah. That's, ugh. That's all I'll say about that. Ugh.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
um, and just taking away that nasty feeling in my stomach I've got about that specific issue, I was thinking about your career and what you've seen, and you've probably met hundreds and thousands of peoples and characters, and you've heard some stories and seen some things. Um, is there like a moment or a story from your work or career that has really stayed with you, or maybe like a theme or something that continues to drive your motivation today?
Yeah, yeah. So I think viewers and listeners will know that I came into this game as a fundamental harm reductionist, but I'm trying to think, around 2009 ish, the NTA, National Treatment Agency, brought over a guy called William White, and he is the author of a book called Slaying the Dragon, which is
Mm,
this like magnum opus treatise on the history of mutual aid. And he came and he did a seminar, and yeah, I knew about recovery, obviously. Particularly 12-step based recovery. I'd flirted with it myself for many a year. But listening to him, and I think his sobriety date was like 1969, and he's still alive, God bless him. I'm still in contact with him. But yeah, he blew my mind, and he said, in fact, you can Google it. He interviewed me, and he said, why is there a war between recovery and harm reduction?
mm,
Who's benefiting from this? Because and I thought, yeah, why is there? Because it's fine, because and I don't know whether he coined the term or I did. I think it might have been me. There's no recovery in graveyards.
yeah,
Keep people alive. And recovery has to be volitional. Can't make somebody. What does it say in the 12-step literature? Attraction, not promotion. If
yeah,
you want what we have and are prepared to go to any length, blah, 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 blah. If you want what we have, not you must have what we have. If you want what we have, I'm prepared to, and here are the steps that you can take, So yeah, meeting William White was the big high spot for me, I think.
a game changer, if
Yeah.
you will. And just on personal experience, what I found is when I removed my preferred drug of choice, which was heroin,
Mm,
when I removed that, what was the most frightening thing is I had like a litany of these secondary addictions, let's call them that for the purpose of the conversation. So
mm,
I had underneath that, I had my diazepam description,
mm,
I had my methadone prescription, I had all sorts of kind of combos of potions and pills that got me
mm,
to where I needed to go, which was inclusive of like illicit antipsychotics,
Mm,
dihydrocodeine.
mm,
Then there was like the weed as well. So once I
mm,
got rid of the primary, then I had all these things that were kind of underpinning it for when I couldn't get my primary. And
mm,
then when I finally got to the point when I was rid of them, then I was left with like the baseline ones, which was smoking. It was once I got rid of the actual baseline, it was then about the kind of addictive behavioral traits underneath that. So
mm,
this notion of recovery for me,
mm.
I really struggled with that because it was like it becomes something for me that is a lifelong journey and it never ends. And I needed to feel somewhere in my head that that part of my life is over now.
Yeah,
Let me then develop coping strategies and techniques and more healthy addictive traits because
yeah.
I've still got them addictive traits, but they're just
Mm.
not as harmful, Mark. But that was something that I had to find out the hard way, unfortunately.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, absolutely. Yeah, me too, mate. Yeah, I mean, it's whack-a-mole, isn't it? It's whack-a-mole.
It's exactly
You
what's
know,
yeah,
whack-a-mole. Put down the drugs, pick up the drink. Put down the drink, pick up a knife and fork. Put down a knife and fork, pick up a bookmaker's pencil. Put down the
yeah.
bookmaker's pencil, pick up pornography, pick up Tinder. Put down Tinder, yeah, and on and on and on it goes, you know. And for me, I mean, I did everything, pretty much, yeah. The only thing I've never done is ibogaine.
Oh,
But for everything else, ayahuasca, 5-MeO, DMT, to try and purge, all that stuff, all the remnants of the whack-a-mole. Um, but what I what I realize, what I've experienced is, it says on page 63 of the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous, ... we were reborn.
mm,
We were reborn. Then in Bill's story, when Eddie Thatcher's visiting Bill Wilson and Bill's looking at Ebbie across the kitchen table, and he said, his roots grasped new soil. And then elsewhere in the books, we require an entire psychic change.
yeah,
In other words, I have to go through a process that will create an entity and a version of Mark Gilman who no longer needs drink, drugs, whatever. He's perfectly happy to sit by himself, yeah, on his own at 69 years of age, at peace, at one with the world. And finally, it's been a long journey, Paul, but yeah, I'm finally experiencing that now.
Now, before we come to the back end of episode 27, a quick word from our host with an amazing new product hitting the shelves somewhere. Are you tired of authentic remorse? Bringing to you the Too Light, Too Dark Apology Generator. It produces sincere sounding statements like, I'm sorry you felt that way. I take full responsibility for the energy in this room. I regret the timing of my truth. The deluxe model includes tear ducts with adjustable glisten and now featuring auto blame redistribution. Too Light, Too Dark, making apologies since the 80s. Yeah, and yeah, long may that continue.
Mm.
And before I come to the dessert questions, I put together a little exercise called Three Pillars.
Yep.
And I can tell by your roots through travel, through knowing who Steve Hillage is, Deeply Veil, mushrooms,
Right.
all that. I can tell you've got some really good musical taste under there. So just for our listeners, these three pillars are what you like about movies, music, and books. So on that,
Yeah.
for a movie, what's a film you love or that sticks with you, and why does it resonate with you, Mark?
Apocalypse Now.
Mm.
Apocalypse Now. I mean, everything about it. It's my favourite film by a long way. I mean, I like Godfather 1 and Godfather 2. But yeah, Apocalypse Now. I mean, everything about it, the fact that Heart of Darkness, Joseph Conrad, and, what happens to men when they're, given all, yeah, everything about, I mean, and just the Vietnam thing, I mean, because when I lived in California as a hippie man in 1979. I lived with a Vietnam vet. What would I be? I'd be 20. I was 23 and he was 28. He's dead. He died from an overdose while we were there. He died. I woke up one morning, I think September or October 1979, me and a friend from Bury, Anyway, I woke up, we were living on a boat, and we'd been out, doing what we did, and I woke up in the morning, and I came round, it was sun were coming, and I went, "Whoa, I'm rough. Man, I am rough." And my mate
Mm.
went, "You're not as rough as him." So "What?" He went,
Jeez.
"He's rough, he were dead." And, he weren't the first dead body, 'cause that, that's what I'd shared with you before, the other guy. Anyway, so I've been no stranger to death from drugs, but he were particularly tragic because he told us some of the stuff that had happened in Vietnam, and he were only 28, man.
Yeah.
He were 28, I remember that song, "No, no, no, 19, no, 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 19."
Oh yeah, Paul Hardcastle.
Yeah, 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 "No, no, no, 19," and then of course I came back to anyway, and then almost after Burton, he was Burton Blanchard, God bless him, and I came back to the UK, I think I'd been in Athens or somewhere, and it came out, Apocalypse Now came out. And I just and then but this is Bert, this is Bert. So yeah, Apocalypse Now all day.
Yep. Now, before I get onto music, because I suspect it's going to be a long answer, that what's a book that changed how you think, or one that you'd recommend to people or listeners?
A Year in the Life of an Inner City Neighborhood
Mm,
by David Simon and Ed Burns. And it's the book that gave us first The Corner and then The Wire, which
okay.
for me is the best piece of television ever. So yeah, it's a big book, but it's brilliant. And when I still do bits of teaching, I say, I know I'll give you a reading list and you'll never read it, but please just indulge me and just read that one. Read
Yeah.
The Year in the Life of an Inner City Neighborhood, about what life is like for people who use drugs in Baltimore. But for Baltimore, read Edinburgh. For read Manchester. It's what life is on that. A year in the life of an inner city neighborhood. Buy it. It's brilliant.
Cool. I'll add that because we've had Siddhartha by Herman Hesse be mentioned on this podcast, which
Yeah.
is another absolute topper by one of our old guests. And then the classic that I found as a youngster is Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl as well.
Yeah.
So add
Yeah.
your book on top of that, Mark, because that's a hot take. That's three toppers for people to get their teeth into for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Now I'm going to land on the music one for your three pillars. What's maybe a song's going to be too hard for somebody your esteemed experience, Mark? I would say, what's an artist or a genre you always return to? Is there music that helps you reset?
Leonard Cohen.
Mm.
Leonard Cohen. You want it darker. You want it darker. I mean,
Everybody knows, Mark. Everybody knows.
and you want it darker. Too light, too dark. You want it dark. Everybody know. There's a crack where the light gets in.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Leonard every time. Every time.
Interesting. Now, here's the dessert questions that are just for you reflect a little bit. And I suppose where I'd like to kind of sign off for today, something that you've learned would be good for me. So, what has your work and career taught you about people, Mark?
Whew. Try and be, and this sounds hallmark, I apologize for it, but just try and be authentic. Try and remember who you are, you know.
Mm.
But I'm not an idealist in that sense. You've got to put food on the table, you've got to get a job, and if you were straying away from your morals, values, and ethics, do it knowingly, do it knowingly. I mean, my regret is during that period of the successful discharge thing, I didn't say anything, was it first they came for the communists and I didn't say anything, so the time when I was least authentic and that happened, and I'm not saying people would have listened to me, but not only did I go along with it, there were times where I were promoting it to my shame. So yeah, um, try and be authentic, try and work out who you are and live your life as authentically as you can. To your own
Uh,
self be true, to thine own self be true.
yeah. If listeners could take away just one idea from the conversation today, Mark, what would you want that to be?
Harm reduction makes sense. We've always done it. People will always use drugs. They always have, they always will, and there are safer ways of doing it. And it began as a working class mutual aid thing, and long may it continue that way.
So I want to thank you, Mark, today for sharing your time, your perspective, and the work that you've done historically and continue to do around harm reduction. For me, conversations like this remind me that behind policies, headlines, statistics are real people, real lives, and real chances to do things better. If this episode stops you and makes you think, if it challenges something you believed, or simply gives you a slight new perspective, then it's achieved what it's supposed to have done. So check out our website, www.toolighttodark.com. Engage with our socials at Too Light Too Dark on Instagram, TikTok, LinkedIn. Keep the conversation active and moving. This has been Too Light Too Dark, episode 27. So stay gold, stay beautiful, and stay safe. Thank you so much, Mark. Thank you. Namaste.
Namaste.